Hello, everyone. Hello, Nashville Propel families. Welcome to our first speaker series of 2021. I want to thank you for joining us and taking the time out from your family and your busy day to talk about a very, very special subject matter. First, for those who are watching for the first time, I want to tell you a little bit about Nashville Propel and who I am. I'm Sonia Thomas. I'm the executive director for Nashville Propel. And the Propel stands for Parents Requiring Our Public Education System to Lead. And we're on a mission to organize and to develop parents into powerful parent leaders, to ignite a movement that demands equitable education policies and practices right here in Nashville public schools. And that's what we're doing. And so each month, at the end of the month, what we do is we have a special guest, a subject matter expert who comes and talks to our parents. And so tonight, we welcome Mr. Jackson Sprayberry, who is going to be talking to us about MAP assessments. When COVID-19 hit, parents became like teachers, right? So a lot of parents did not know where their children were. And so what we needed to do was make sure that parents understood like what assessments would give them specific information, because we knew that all children need to be assessed, and then a plan wrapped around them to recover our children because of learning loss. And so we asked Mr. Sprayberry to come and to educate parents. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. Mr. Sprayberry is the founding head of school at Valor Collegiate Prep or College Prep. And we're glad to have him here with us. I'll let him give a little bit more overview of himself because he can do that better than me. But we welcome you, Mr. Sprayberry. Thank you for joining us. I think you're on mute.
Got it. Thanks for having me. I'm going to go back and forth probably between looking up and then looking at the camera. I'm used to looking at a webcam, but it's not working tonight. I'm so sorry. So if you see me just looking above, I promise I'm paying attention and I'm looking at a screen. And so, as mentioned, I am the head of school. I'm the founding head of school at Valor College Prep here in Southeast Nashville. I've been here for about 5 years. Before opening our high school, I was an assistant principal at one of our middle schools, and that's where I started to better understand MAP. And so I'm really excited to share some of this with you, because if I'm being totally honest, even though I have a master's degree in education, I was pretty intimidated by MAP. It is not something that we necessarily talked about inside of my graduate program, and it really does take some time to understand what it is, generally speaking. But then inside of it, there's just all these weird terms. Like we're going to talk about RIT score and norming data and a response to intervention and all of this stuff that at first glance feels like kind of off-putting if you're anything like me, where it's like, well, that's just too much to know. But the reality is that it is pretty simple if you take the time to break it down and really look at it. And so hopefully we have the chance to look through some of that tonight. And then I've got my contact information at the end. I'd be happy to help individually if we need to via email if there are certain things that we don't answer. Anything else that you want me to share before I jump in? Oh no, I think.
Thank you for that, because what we know is parents get these assessments. They don't know what they're used for. They don't understand how to read them. They don't understand a lot of things. And so we thought it would be very important that parents understand, when you get a result from a MAP assessment, what does that actually mean? So thank you again, and we can go ahead and get started. And then parents, if you have questions, please put them in the comments, and we will try to address your questions.
Perfect. All right. And then is the best way for me to do this to go through the presentation, and then you take the questions as we go? Will you just interrupt me?
Yes. So go ahead and go through your presentation. That would be great. And then at the end, we'll have a little dialogue and take questions from parents.
Perfect. I'm really good at being interrupted, so just jump right in if there's something that I need to do. I'm happy to stop talking. All right. So I'm really excited to be with you all. We're going to talk a little bit about MAP growth. Let's jump in together. So this first slide that you're going to see here is probably, there are two different options that you might have when you get your report from MAP. This is the simplest version, and depending on where you go to school and how your administrator or your school-based team gives you that information, it may look something like this. And we're going to get into it in just a minute, but I wanted you to see what it looks like. The second thing that you're going to notice, some other schools might give a report that looks like this. This one is a little more complex, but we're going to break down both of them. And before we get there, we're going to do a quick overview. So MAP is simply an assessment that measures what your student knows and then what they're ready to learn. That's the simplest way to think about it. It was created by this nonprofit organization called the NWEA in 1977. It's this partnership between researchers and educators, and they really do want students and their families and schools and school districts to understand where their students are. But that's not enough to just understand where students are. We have to understand what to do with that once we get it. And so hopefully we can both understand how to break down our MAP data tonight, and then also think through ways that we can use that data. So all schools across the country and even across the world, it's 50 states, 140 countries, just over 11 million students take this test annually. And, to get a representative sample in a true standardized way, they even pay a couple of schools to take it to make sure that they get enough of a representative sample. So let's dig in. So how it works is that you can see across the bottom here, and hopefully you can see that on the screen where my cursor is. Yep. The first question that your student takes when they sit down to take the MAP test, it's an adaptive test. And so if your student answers the question correctly, the next question gets harder. And then if they get to that third question and they get it wrong, it goes down a little bit and the rigor drops down a little bit. And if they get that one wrong, it drops down a little bit. And then they answer it. So you can see that it's adaptive, and essentially it's based on the question and the answer that came right before it. It always starts with a question that's on your student's grade level, and then it adjusts along the way. So here's what it measures. It measures in this score called a RIT score. I'm not going to try to describe what RIT is, what it stands for. I don't personally think that it really matters. The thing that I think is most important here is that your RIT score is essentially what a student knows regardless of their grade level. And it also is what we would consider to be an industry standard. So it's this idea that no matter where you are in the world, you can trust that this RIT score is accurate, so long as your student took the test seriously. This scale score precisely measures student performance, regardless of whether they're currently on grade level, above grade level, or below grade level. And then what happens is once students take this test, every 3 years, schools like ours are provided with what we call norms. And it's just anonymous data from all 11 million of those students that help us see what's normative in relation to other students across the country. And so I'm not going to dig into this actual scale here, but you can see essentially that in kindergarten, this would be the low end of the range in terms of the RIT score, and then the upper end, and then it grows as students get older. But we'll get into that in just a minute. So you might ask yourself, well, what do schools do with this, or what should they be doing with it? Well, they should be identifying and qualifying students for certain instructional strategies. So the way that we use it here at Valor in our middle schools is that if we see that certain students are maybe above grade level, we might want to push those students with some extension activities. Or if we see that students are below grade level, we might target those students for small group pools when we notice that a lesson that's coming up is a little bit above where they might find themselves. It might guide teachers who don't usually use data to make decisions. If you put this data out in front of a teacher, ideally they would make better instructional decisions for their students. It can help us as schools with scheduling and grouping students to meet students' learning needs. It's a nationally normed test. And so if you have a student who maybe has an IEP, or they might be a part of what they call tier 3 or tier 2 instruction, RTI time, that could be based off of this test. And then it also helps schools think through staffing and resourcing, and where they need to allocate their funding year over year. So your student does get a RIT score, and that RIT score doesn't matter whether you're in 4th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, or kindergarten. Absolutely does not matter. It has the same meaning across all grade levels. And so if a 4th grader and an 8th grader have the same RIT score in reading, it shows that that 4th grader and that 8th grader are at the exact same level in that subject. And because it's such a stable scale across all grade levels, it allows teachers to accurately measure where students are in their academic growth, both in the current school year, but then over time. I included these slides that are coming up not to go deep into each of them, but I included these slides as a reference because hopefully we can share out this slide deck. You all can use it when you get your student score reports from MAP to better understand where your students are. I'm going to orient you to one slide though. So this is a lot. I'm just going to pause and let you sit in it for a second, because when I look at this, it's just like, that's too many numbers for me. And so if you orient to it, essentially what you see here is across the top, student grade levels, kindergarten through 12th grade. Down here on the left, you're going to see NWEA. That's the company that does the MAP test. Here it's going to tell you when they looked at it. Most of the time, students take their MAP tests in the fall, the winter, and the spring. And then this red row right here across the middle shows you the 50th centile, or 50th percentile. This 50th percentile is just the average student in that grade level. So if you have a MAP RIT score for your 2nd grader, and your 2nd grader scores a 172, that means that your student is right smack in the middle of all 2nd graders across the country. That means that they scored better than 50% of students, and that 50% of students scored better than they did, which is what that percentile means over on the right. If you've got a 2nd grader who scores a 197 on the reading section in their RIT score on the MAP test, what that would show you is that they were in the 95th percentile nationally. That means they did better than 95% of all students in the country. Only 5% of students did better than they did on that section. And so hopefully these will be able to help you as you navigate your student scores once you get those back. The other thing is, starting in 5th grade, and so if we've got some K through 4 families or caregivers on the call, you'll just have to stick with these numbers to compare nationally to your grade level. But once you hit 5th grade, you actually start to get some ACT predictive data. And as you know, the ACT is the test that students take in 11th grade in the state of Tennessee, and it's what is linked to the Hope Scholarship for public college and university funds. If a student scores a 21 or higher on their ACT, or if they have a 3.0 GPA, they get a pretty nice scholarship to go to a public university in the state of Tennessee. And so if you've got a 5th grader and you look at their score report and they score a 218 on the reading section, what that means is that your student is on track to score at or above a 24 on the ACT. And so once you hit that 5th grade mark, you really start to get some predictive data about what might be true for them when they take that ACT in 11th grade. But as you can see, all of these include just their individual grade levels and where they fall. And all of this data is normative based off of July of 2020. So it's the most recent one. So whatever you get from your school for your student score report, you could use these. So we've got one for reading. There's one for math, language usage, science, and those are the sections of MAP. So when you look at all of these, you'll be able to hopefully use these charts to say, like, okay, my student is on their science section, they're in 3rd grade and they scored a 194. Great, they're about the 69th percentile. So they did better than 69% of students. All right, so here's what a report might look like. So a quick reference, and again, this is just a reference. It may look different depending on the school that you go to and what your educators provide, but each section, like we just looked at, so here's the mathematics section, it should give you all of this information no matter what it looks like. You'll have your students' demographic information across the top. It'll give the subject area, and then it will tell you where the student fell as it relates to average achievement. And that's one of the important things to know about the MAP test. It measures both achievement, where your student currently is as it relates to their grade level, and then it also calculates their growth. And so when I look at this student, I would be incredibly proud of Christopher. And the reason why I'd be incredibly proud of Christopher is because when I get this score report, I can see that he's in the 47th percentile nationally. So he's right in the middle. 50% of students did better, 50% of students did worse than Christopher. Christopher's pretty average as it relates to math for his grade. That's right in the sweet spot. But if you go over here to the growth section, that's where we're most proud of Christopher. Because Christopher was in the 96th percentile nationally for growth. So even though he was only right in the middle for actual what he knows and where he falls as it relates to math, he did better. He grew more than 96% of all students that took this test. And so this is one way to look at this. And if your school gives you this type of report, this is probably the easiest one to understand. Right here, this number, the most recent one, is going to show you where Christopher is in fall of 2019. But if your student's taken MAP more than once, it should show all of their data so that you can see the trend line for your student. The other way to look at this, though, is this bigger, more complex report. And we won't have to get into all of it, but I did put it here as reference for you. So this is what a report might look like, and you might get one of these for every subject that's on MAP. And then these little red boxes here would correlate with this glossary for you. I'm not going to try to go over all of this for you because it's just a lot of information and I'm trying to show it to you as a reference. But this should give you all of that information and it correlates to all of these boxes. Hopefully your school gives you this version. But if they don't, and they give you this version, you should be able to reference this. And if this doesn't quite make sense, you could always just send me an email at the end. All right, the next thing before we jump into the Q&A is, what do you do with the data as a family? Well, Khan Academy, if you're not familiar with Khan Academy, it's a free online resource, it's open source, and anybody has access to it. You can actually log into Khan Academy, and this is a screenshot I took earlier today. You can log in, you can put exactly what your students scored for their RIT score into Khan Academy, and it will create a full playlist for you. So it will allow you, like if you're anything like me, if I'm being super honest, I might be able to help my student with reading, but if my student came back at 50th percentile or below in math, and they were like, hey, you got to help me on this, I would be like, we got to get you on Khan Academy because Dad's not gonna be able to help with this. You wouldn't want me helping with math. And so I would turn it over to Khan Academy and use this because it's a totally free resource. If you coupled Khan Academy with Tennessee's free homework help hotline, you could really do some good things with your student and their score. And that's the way that I would approach it. And then I'll just pause here, and I'm sure that there's going to be some questions. So let's see what we got.
First of all, thank you. That's a whole lot of information, but it is so needed. And I'll just kind of kick it off with the questions until we have the questions to start to come across the screen. And so we have a lot of families that get their MAP assessment. And one of the questions that we've gotten, hello, Joyce, about their MAP assessment. What does growth really mean, Jackson? Mm-hmm. in terms of an individual child? And how do we know as a parent when someone says to us, well, your child, you know, they grew 13 points since the last assessment? How do we know what that really means for each child? And does growth always mean that we're headed in a good direction?
Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty, I'm going to give a nuanced, potentially complicated answer, and feel free to jump in. So if you get a score report that looks like this, the way that you would know what your student, how your student should be growing, you would see that here in this section where it says growth projection. And so this will tell you the term and the year. So this student that we're looking at says fall 2009 all the way up to fall 15. I see if I can zoom in. Nope, I can't. This says that in 9th grade, this student was projected to grow 3 points on their RIT score. But the student actually had -5 growth. So I would look at this for this sample student and say, one, did you take the test seriously? That's the first thing I would ask my student. Like before they take the MAP test, I would say like, look, even if this isn't for a grade, you got to take it seriously. And the reason why is because if they don't take it seriously, they're not going to get accurate data. So that's the first thing. But if you can trust that your student gave it all they had, you can look at this report to see what the projected growth was and whether or not they met it. Now, to answer your question about how do we know if it's good or not? The baseline would be, you would want whatever that growth projection number is, you would want your student to hit that growth metric. So if it says 4, this RIT growth needs to say 4, because that is what they are using. And they're using both your individual students' data over time and all 11 million students across the country who have been at the exact same level as your student is now, but maybe are 3 years later. They're doing all of that data projection on the back end. And so you can trust this projection because it's 11 million students every single year. I will say that the further above the 50th percentile your student gets, the smaller the growth expected is. Because once you get to a certain level, it's really hard to get from, if you're in 5th grade and you're already reading at an 11th grade level, it's hard to move that to a 12th grade level. So that growth number is going to be smaller. But if your student's further down away from the 50th percentile, you'll likely see a larger growth metric because it would be expected that your student would grow because they are a little behind where other students would be at that grade level. Does that answer your question fully?
It does, but I want to really get this down to where parents understand it. Another question is, at what percentile should a parent be worried? What is the red flag with, we start this test, at 3rd grade, this assessment? What is the red flag zone? What's the red flag zone, the yellow zone, and then the house is on fire zone? Because that's where a lot of our parents are finding ourselves, in the house is on fire zone. At what point should a parent be so alarmed that they are banging on that school door, Jackson?
I think it could be a nuanced answer again. If you could show my shared screen one more time, I can show you what I would look at if I were a parent. So right here, you're going to see 3 different lines. This blue one is the student score. So right here, you see it, student score, boom, boom. The dotted line is what they project. That's the projected growth. This orange line is the district. And so that should be where all of MNPS is for a student in that grade level. And then this yellow line is where all students that took the test are and their trajectories. I would personally say that if my student was significantly lower on their RIT score compared to the district, I would ask my administrator, I would ask my child's teacher, what's being done to support my student? My student is below the district average. How are you using this data to make sure they get at least on average? How are you using this data to make sure that they meet their growth goal? Where is that in your lesson plan? Where does that happen inside of the school day? Is that in PLT time? Are you doing small group pools? Are you tracking students using this data? Like, how are you using the data? And if it were me, for an individual student, if my student's RIT score was below the district, I would want my school to give me some answers. And then if the district score is significantly lower than the national average, I might ask some questions too. What's going on? Why is our district the way that it is compared to national data?
That's a very important piece of information for parents to know. So the blue line is where the student is, and if it's below what the district is, then you're going to start asking questions. And if the district is below what the national average is, then we need to ask even more questions, because we see that we have a system issue.
That would be my approach. It's going to be a little harder to see transparently if this is the report, because you can see here, this report, if you look at it this way, only shows the national achievement data. It doesn't show the individual school data. So if you don't have access to something like this, I would personally ask some questions and say, hey, okay, this is great data. I'm glad to know where my student is, and I'm glad to know they're right smack in the middle for math achievement, and they really hit it out of the park for their growth. But what about compared to the school, compared to the district? I want to know that data, and I would ask for it.
Wow. So let's see if we can see any questions on here. If our producer could help us to see any parent questions. Visha Hawkins is asking whether your child, she's saying whether your child is below average or average, ask your child's teacher. What can they do to get your child to average or above average? Very good point, Visha. Yeah. I do have a question about the report.
Can I say one quick thing in response to that?
Yes.
I would also, this is going to, depending on what grade level your student's in, you might need to temper expectations. Because if your student is in 5th grade and you get this report back that they're actually at the 25th percentile, they're actually maybe just at like a 2nd grade reading level, it might not be realistic from December to May to take a 5th grader at a 2nd grade reading level and get them to average. That might not be possible. But the non-negotiable is, what is being done to make sure that my student hits their growth projection? In fact, what's being done to make sure that my student is going above their growth projection? What is the school strategy? What is the teacher strategy to make sure that all of our students are hitting their growth projections or exceeding it?
Are there any laws around interventions for children who are not doing well?
On MAP, that's a hard question.
What about RTI?
For RTI, so the way that RTI works in the state of Tennessee is that a school is legally required to provide RTI, which is called response to intervention. Like, I'll give you a high school example. For a student in high school, we don't use MAP test anymore in high school at Bauer. We use a practice ACT, but our middle schools use the MAP. Based off of the way that a student scores in the spring from the prior school year, that helps us staff RTI. It helps us roster RTI. And legally, schools are required to put students who, and I might get this number just slightly off, but I believe it's if a student falls in the 10th percentile or below on a nationally normed test. on a standardized test. So that could be TN Ready, that could be a MAP assessment, that could be an ACT. There are a couple of other ones. If they are at the 10th percentile or below, your student should be in an RTI class, be it a tier 2 or a tier 3 class. And what they do in that space is, like in high school, they have to be in that space for 225 minutes per week. I'll take a 9th grader. I've got a 9th grader that goes to Algebra 1, but that 9th grader is in the 10th percentile. So 90% of students are doing better than they are. I should be using that map data to create an individualized learning plan for that student to teach them on grade level material that better helps them navigate Algebra 1. Because the reality is that we've got students that are in Algebra 1 being asked to do, linear equations, but they're still struggling with adding and subtracting fractions. We don't teach how to add and subtract fractions in Algebra 1. The expectation is that you know it. And that's why RTI exists. RTI exists to teach students at their grade level, and we use map data or another standardized test to get there.
Great, thanks. So Quasia Walker is asking, who do you ask for your child's scores?
It's different depending on the school. If it were me, I would start with if my student had a homeroom, I would maybe start with my homeroom teacher. Or if they don't have a homeroom, maybe if there's like a grade level lead. So I know that at our school we've got like a teacher who heads up our 9th grade. And then if those don't exist, I would reach out to your school's leadership team. Some schools have family engagement coordinators that you could reach out to. I probably wouldn't start with the principal, though. You might not get a response, but I would definitely start with a homeroom teacher or a grade level lead, and then kind of work my way up until I found who I needed to ask.
Great. So start with the teacher. So it's kind of go a little chain of command. You really shouldn't have to ask for these scores. They should be
sent.
They should be shared with you because they're assessments to kind of gauge your child's growth. So first of all, if you're not getting these scores, which at this point we're working on our 2nd score for the school year, and I think MNPS just kind of wrapped up over a week or so ago on MAP assessments. You should not have to ask for them, but I would be worried if I had to ask for something and somebody is not getting me something. So that's why we want to make sure that we are educating parents around the importance of having these assessments and, asking for them, demanding them, but then also asking the question, what's the delay of you getting these scores? I'm sure that there's like, I think Ms. Burke said that these scores are readily available, after the students take them. So it's not like they have to go and send off forms. They are available. Let's see. Torvis Gardner says, how are the schools and districts using this data? So if you can recap that. And parents need this information with the printout of the MAP results. The administrators should be using individualized learning plans with interventions to help students to get on grade level. And to Torvis's point, he had a question about how to use that data, but also individualized learning. This is one of the reasons why we're asking for this for every student. Is because we know in this climate that we're in that a lot of children are just struggling being in virtual school and being out of the in-person class. A lot of them were already struggling, but we know that this is going to be catastrophic. So Nashville Propel has been calling on school leaders all over Nashville, all MNPS schools, charter and traditional, to put into place individualized learning plans for students to recover them from learning loss. So I'm glad to see that you guys are doing that. I hope that you guys are excited about Dr. Battle's plans of personalized learning for each student in the district. But if you could recap how schools use this data and how districts use this data.
Yes, I will say before I forget, I don't know why this is, and I should probably know. We typically see a little bit of a dip for the winter scores. Mm-hmm. So you've got a fall test. Mm-hmm. The winter scores historically at Valor, overall kind of tailed down a little bit. And then the spring, they pop back up. So I just want to make sure that anybody that's on the call right now or on this live stream, don't get too alarmed if your winter score is a dip. That is at least what we've seen happen at our school. But the way that, to recap, the way that this should be used is that your school's administrators and intervention team should be taking any student who is at the 10th percentile or below on a standardized test like this, and using that data to place them in an RTI class. That should be separate and apart from any of their other classes. So they should go to all of their grade level classes, and then they should go to this. The difference is if your student has an IEP that requires them to have resource minutes take precedent over tiered intervention. So if your student has an IEP and they're in resource, they might not be in a tier 3 intervention because they're getting their grade level support. So this is really like a 3rd percentile to 10th percentile. And then ideally the way the school should be using it is they should take this individualized data, plug it into whatever system they're using, whether it's a personalized learning plan like what you just shared that Dr. Battle is doing in some schools. Or if the teacher isn't using one of those and they're doing direct instruction, they should analyze all of the students in their class. And really, ideally, the ratio, I think, is like 1 to 12 teacher to student in these intervention classes. And they should pick the standards and objectives that the group of 12 haven't yet mastered based off of this data to then drive their instruction. And if your student's in a tiered intervention class, you should probably ask questions if you're not seeing growth on this. I would ask some questions of my school. If you know that your student's in RTI and they're not making growth or they're just making average growth, I would say, hey, can you talk to me a little bit about what happens inside of that RTI time? Are they just on a computer with their headphones in? How do you know? Like, tell me a little bit more about what that instruction looks like.
Yes, because we know that if we invest time, if we put in the right interventions for a child, we know that they're going to grow. And so Mary Bell just asked, what is RTI? It is response to intervention. That is data collected. And I think it speaks to itself. You should be seeing a response to whatever interventions are being put in place. This information is also used for students that may need special education, like a screener or a diagnostic. And if your school is not collecting RTI, first of all, they're breaking the law. We just had to get on a school that was not collecting RTI, and it was a charter school, and we got on them about not collecting the RTI information on students. First of all, that's breaking the law. Second of all, that information, you cannot even have a diagnostic or a screener, a comprehensive evaluation on that child. No psychologist is going to do that without that prior data. They can know at all. So that they can even know at all, they're going to refuse to do it. And so, and it's because they don't even know where to start. And so, if you request the S-team meeting, or if you have sent up a red flag saying, I want my son or my daughter tested for a learning disability, if that school has not collected RTI, you're going to lose time. And the thing is, if you've gotten all the way to that point, that's scary. If you're asking them to screen your child for learning disability because they're just not performing the way that they should be, and then nobody has done anything.
Right, and that is what happens in that RTI space. I know that's what you're saying, but just to double down on it, your student has to be. We have to collect data points on your student in order for a school psychologist to be able to say, yes, we'll do this additional testing. And if your student's not in RTI, that means they're not in a tier 2 or a tier 3 intervention. And unless we have like several weeks, sometimes even months worth of tiered intervention data, we can't assess for an IEP for the school psychologist. And so my biggest takeaway for you all, if you're on this call or if you're sharing this with individuals, if you get this report back and on any of the sections, your student is in the 10th percentile or below. Actually, I would probably even say 15th percentile or below.
I was getting ready to say 25. Anything 25 and below. I mean, anything. Look, if you're 50 and below, you should be asking questions. Do not wait for your children to drop down to 30 and 40 and 15 and 10%. That is too late.
Mm-hmm.
It's too late.
If you get one of these reports back, and I see that the screen is shared again, so I'll go to it, and you see here in this section, right here, if you get one that looks like this and it's this middle column right here, if on that most recent one up here, that number is 25 or below, or if you get one that looks like this and on the achievement section, this number is 25 or below, I would say, based off of my students' MAP data, what is the tiered intervention response that their teachers are providing as a result of that? And you can certainly ask questions if they're in the 25th percentile or below. And if you can hear a storm, there's a storm coming, and it's like right outside the window, so sorry if it's loud. If what I was getting, if you're 25th percentile or below, certainly ask those questions. If they're 50th percentile and below, ask questions. But if they're like 25th to 10th percentile, your student should probably be in a tier 2 intervention of some sort. And if they're in the 10th to 2nd percentile, they should be in a tier 3 intervention. And if you don't know if your student is in that, and that's what you see in the MAP data, I would ask questions. I would say my student's in the 10th percentile. What is the RTI they're in? Can you tell me a little bit about it? How does that support them in their growth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to the parents who are listening, your child should not be struggling. This is what he's saying. Should not be struggling and not having an intervention. If that child is struggling, they should have it. And I don't care if they're in a virtual setting or not. So let's dismiss that. Even if they're in a virtual setting, RTI should be collected on them. And if it's not, tonight you know. So you're going to email tomorrow and you're going to ask what tier they're in and what interventions are being put in place. And you're going to let them know that you would like to know the progress within those interventions, and ask them not to stop those interventions until they have met with you. And then there's a plan to make sure that student stays there. Because oftentimes what happens is those interventions are stopped. You don't even know they stopped. And then you'll see the child, you have a roller coaster child who is up and down in proficiency in all areas. And it's because sometimes the intervention was stopped and maybe the intervention didn't need to be stopped if they're just because they're showing progress. So that, let's see, Maribel is saying a sheet with these questions would help to have. And Maribel, we're going to provide these slides to parents. And do you have something like that? Yeah, so we're going to provide the deck with this information, and parents can reach out and ask questions. This is not our last time talking about this subject because it is so deep. Even today in planning, we realized that we needed to make sure that we take even sections of this information and continue the discussion, because this is not going away. And it's important that our parents understand how this data is used.
And I could take some screenshots of this. This is from the state manual. If you can share my screen, I can show you what we were talking about. So this is directly from the state, and this
State
is State of Tennessee. It's tier 2 description. So you see here, tier 1 instruction is what all students get, full stop. If your student's in 5th grade, tier 1 instruction is all their 5th grade classes. But you can see here, in addition to that tier 1 instruction, tier 2 is about 10 to 15% of students in a school building. And look here, it says students who score below the designated cut score on the universal screening. The universal screening could be MAP, will receive more intensive intervention in tier 2. It says they should be based on national norms, which is what we just talked about, to identify students who are at risk. It says, as a guideline, students below the 25th percentile would be considered at risk.
Mm-hmm. And so I want you to go back to that first sentence real quick, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
It says students who score below the designated cut score on the universal screening, which is MAP at some schools. Are there other names of assessments?
It could be, it's any standardized test. The schools, depending, have a slight discretion on how they do it.
Okay. The word that I want you to see, parents, grandparents, is will receive. That is not a negotiable. That's not to be negotiated. It says will receive.
And the thing that is most important here, and this is depending on where you're in school, and sorry to interrupt, but notice this from the state. And this might be something that we need to take up, like I say we, if this is something that this organization wanted to pursue, you can see this section though. And this is the hard part. Depending on where you're in school and the number of students in your school that are the 25th percentile and below, it says if a school has a large number of students failing below national or falling below national norms, the school may use relative norms. So let's say you go to school A inside the district, and the average student at that school is at the 25th percentile. They may not be required to put all students in response to intervention. They may be able to say, okay, only students that are in the 25th percentile and below inside of our school are going to be an RTI. It says here, if a school has a high population of struggling students, relative norms allow a school staff to determine which students have the greatest need for intervention. A school then uses those relative norms to serve students that are most at risk.
Wow. And then, wait a minute, let's unpack that. We have a whole school of children who are at risk. And so relative norms can be used to determine which one of all of those students who are at risk get the intervention. So some children get left on the battlefield based on the population of the school.
Yes, and you can see that here. So like if you look at your student score report and you're able to see the district, well, this would be a district grade, but a student's grade. If your school's RIT is below the 25th percentile, then technically speaking, the school gets to decide as a school leader who inside of our school, since everybody's at the 25th percentile or the majority of students are the 25th percentile or below, who gets this extra intervention. And so to be clear, your school may not have your student in a tier 2 or a tier 3 intervention, even though they're at the 25th percentile or below, not because they don't care, but they may not have the staffing. The state may not be providing the funding, because you can see here in the guidelines that the school gets to decide how to do that. And so if that's the case for you, you might ask some questions like, well, how did you determine which students got put into RTI? And that would probably be my follow-up question would be, okay, my students at the 15th percentile and they're not getting tier 2 or tier 3 instruction. How did you decide who gets that tiered instruction?
That is scary because we have close to 20 low performing schools that perform in the bottom 5% of the state. And this is the scary part. The scary question about these scores, if the whole population of student is not doing well, who are you comparing them to? And so that is criminal. And I know you can't participate in this conversation right here, so you can just look at me if you want to, but it's criminal. And I'm gonna say it again, it is criminal to decide who gets to put on the oxygen mask when the oxygen is running out. Which one of y'all we gonna save, and which one of y'all we gonna let die? That's what that means to me. Shame on the state of Tennessee and school districts. Shame on you. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jackson.
Oh, you're
Jackson didn't
fine.
say any of that, but I can because I'm somebody's mama. And that's why we represent families from our most struggling communities because of this bull. But that's
And
okay. We're going to organize parents. We're going to develop parents into powerful parent leaders. We are igniting a movement that demands equitable education policies. And damn it, that's what we're going to do. Because of that, I'm sorry, Jackson, but that's criminal. Somebody need to go to jail. Sorry. Yeah, I said it and I will say it again. That's criminal. Go on, Jackson, because I'll keep going.
I first of all, I just want to the thing I will respond to that because the thing I will say is that like I'm incredibly grateful that you all exist as an organization and mobilize families and caregivers to advocate for equitable outcomes for students. And I think that one of the most important things, which is why this organization exists, is that it's the people who put people in power that have the power. And so whether it's an issue like this or another issue that somebody takes up, if enough people respond and it becomes a trend in the feedback, it makes it harder to ignore. And when families mobilize about any issue, typically you get results.
We're coming.
And I will share this document with you because this is directly from the state's website. And I would say for this specific topic, if this was something that you wanted to kind of organize and mobilize around, that would be a state level issue because the state is the one who then gives the district and the school the autonomy to intervene. And so
the state puts these laws together and then they go AWOL. That's what they do. Nobody's held accountable to anything. There's this, and I know, and I know I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the parents. Then everybody goes AWOL on us. And so that's why we're training you so you can navigate the system. So because when that's when you got power. And what has happened is parents have been shamed. They have been shamed because they have trusted the system, right? They've trusted the system to do what's right. And so shame on the state of Tennessee. I'm saying it, Dr. Swin, Governor Lee, shame on you. Shame on you.
I saw a question come through about the way this is used for 504s and for IEPs. Would that be helpful to share a little bit?
Yes, we have a lot of parents who have students with IEPs and 504s, which that is about, let's talk about that. That is about the accommodations, guys, that your child needs based on their disability. IEPs are about, and I think a lot of parents are getting that a little mixed up because it's just about the accommodation, the thing that you need to assist the child. So interventions around your child, this should still apply, right? Jackson, like this part does not change. Your IEP is about the accommodation, and that's why we want personalized learning plans for all students, because what is happening is parents are thinking that because their child has an IEP that this stuff is different for their child academically. No, if your child, I'm going to give you an example. Your child is visually impaired. They have a disability. The accommodations is the glasses and how those glasses help with progress. And so if those glasses are not strong enough, then we tweak the glasses and make the glasses strong enough. Disability does not mean low IQ all the time. So if your child has an IEP, it is about the tools, the accommodations, the glasses, the screen, the guide, the time they may need additionally to accommodate them to do the same thing that everybody else does, because they are just as genius as everybody else. And so these interventions, these tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, the RTI, it should apply to your child. And we've got to really educate parents on what an IEP means, because that's where parents are missing it, and it's not their fault. The expectations have been lowered for your student, and you have colleges and universities that have students with IEPs. They should be able to go get a degree and do whatever they want to do, just like everybody else. I'm sorry, Jackson.
You're fine.
I might have answered it for you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're okay. And just so you know, and again, sorry, that storm noise I know is potentially getting loud. So sorry if it's getting in the way. I will say that, and this document is like kind of intimidating. The one that I've got on the shared screen, and it's like 130 pages, and it's really it's a lot. But it tells you every single policy. Like, I know we were asking earlier, like, what does that mean? Like, those data points that you were talking about. You can see it here. It's like, this is what progress monitoring is inside of tier 2. It has to happen at least every other week. We have to use data to make decisions. Like, you can see here, even down to like, in order to make a database decision to move from tier 2 to tier 3, you have to have at least 8 to 10 data points. But if that's every other week, it's 10 to 15 if they're monitored weekly. So think about that for a second. If it's weekly, I need between 10 and 15 weeks worth of data to move a student from tier 2 to tier 3.
Losing time.
And then this is probably the most helpful thing for me. When I think about how this data is used, and I'm gonna see if I can walk you through it. So you see where it says universal screening process here?
Yes.
Schools get to decide. You should ask your school, what is our universal screener?
Mm-hmm.
We make decisions about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 instruction. What is our universal screener?
Mm-hmm.
And then once you know that, you can say like, okay, students exceeding grade level expectations, we don't need to worry about it. At risk or not at risk, everybody gets this tier 1 instruction we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But then if a student based off of that screener is at risk, they might jump directly to tier 3, or they might move into tier 2. And then if they're making progress, we might move them back out. Or if they aren't, we might move them to tier 3. And then from there, you can see that once a student's in tier 3, when we get 10 to 12 weeks, 10 to 15 weeks worth of data, and the student's still not making progress, that's when we might consider a student for special education in an IEP. And then if you go into this, and now we're talking about tier intervention, but you can see exactly what should be happening at a minimum if your student's in a tier 2. So like, I know that we're in a conversation now about like whether or not your school is even putting your student in a tier 2 or tier 3 based off of relative norms. But if your student is in a tier 2 or a tier 3 intervention, this document tells you exactly what should be happening and what data should be being observed. And you should be able to ask for this.
That's right.
And you can see here that interventions have to be implemented with integrity. And if it's not implemented with integrity, at least 80% or greater, the interventionist should be supported with training until the integrity does reach 80%.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that word integrity, and then we got to close. Integrity is doing what's right even when you're not looking. So when you're not in school with your child, the integrity is that the action or the intervention, or even the people who are implementing the interventions are doing that and doing what's right even when you're not looking. So I know we got to go. It is 7:03. This has been a great conversation. As a matter of fact, I think we can piggyback off of some of this stuff, Jackson. So thank you so much. I mean, do you want to have any closing thoughts before we go? Any closing remarks?
I just think I would say I appreciate all of you taking the time on an afternoon to know more about what's going on inside of your student's school. It's complicated, but it's not so complicated that you can't figure it out. And by doing sessions like this, and then my email is on that slide deck. You can send me an email if you've got a question. I'd be more than happy to answer. In virtual learning, my email is kind of all over the place, so it might take me a little longer than normal, but no question is too silly. I can show you where it is. I can do my best to give you an answer. I won't necessarily be the one that tells you like you should advocate for X policy,
Right.
but I can definitely equip you with whatever data that you need to better understand some of this stuff. I really do want every single student in this city to have an adequate access to education, no matter where they go to school. And I want to make sure that we fund it at a level that allows them to. And if I can provide any sort of information that breaks down any of the barriers that you might see that stand in your way to advocate, whatever that may look like, I'm happy to help.
But Jackson, thank you so much. And you know what? We knew that you felt like that. And so that's why you're here. If you didn't feel like you wanted every child to succeed, you wouldn't be on here. So thank you so much for putting together this great presentation. And the parents, if you can see the comments, they are shouting you out. They are saying, thank you, Jackson. Thank you, Jackson, because this was much needed. And I think, if parents, if you put in the comments, if you want us to do this again soon, just say, do this again. And we're going to make sure that that we bring up this discussion again. So thank you again, guys. Join us on Wednesday for our Access Denied show at 11 a.m. where we talk about the issues that keep parents awake at night. And we'll recap this conversation. Thank you again, Jackson, and everyone have a wonderful night.